Welcome, my friends, to the Sage of Quay Radio Hour, your home for free and critical thinking, and I'm your host, Mike Williams. Returning to the show today is fellow Beatles researcher Ofer Zeevy. Ofer is from Israel, and he recently published his book, The Best Show in the World, which presents and discusses his research into the McCartney and Beatles conspiracy. And so, without further ado, here's Ofer. Well, folks, we have a great show. Ofer Zeevy is back with me, and Ofer has just released his own Paul is Dead book, and it's the first of its type in Israel. And so we're going to talk about his experience with releasing the book on June 30th of this year, 2021, and how it's going, and also to get Ofer's insights on various other aspects of the conspiracy. I hold Ofer's research in high regard, and I really do enjoy talking with you, Ofer. And welcome back to the show. Tell us a little bit about what motivated you to write the book.
Well, as I explained, first of all, hi, Mike, and thanks for having me on your show again. As I explained in the opening comments of my book, I basically grew up on the rumor. And, but it was something that was, left out for many years. And all of a sudden it came back. So this is something I had to just check, because why would we need two narratives? We have a story.
Right. It's
not true because it was only a rumor. It relates to the biggest band in the world. And so what's going on? It was really fascinating to really re-examine the two narratives. And in fact, this is what I've done in my book, because you don't get a situation where one of the most famous people in the world, not only in music, is presenting us with two narratives which are completely different. For a story, the Beatles story, if you're, the average Beatles fan, you know the story, you know the albums, you know the music. So all of a sudden, something completely new. So why? Why is that? Well, this was the main reason. And I also wanted to really try and bring the subject out here in Israel. And my position in the book, by the way, is I of course support the new information, because the old information has many holes, and we'll talk about it today. But I'm leaving the subject open for anyone to read, check the references. All of my references are, open. Videos on YouTube, your videos, books you can buy on Amazon. I don't have any secret information from a secret source. And everyone can read and think for himself. And I write it very clearly. You need to have a lot of, you need to do a lot of critical thinking. But I'm saving you, not you, but the reader time, because I try to cover as much as I can and present as much information as I can about the subject.
Okay, and how has the book been received, Ofer, in Israel?
Well, I think that the Beatles fans don't like it, to say the least. I think the people who are not avid Beatles fans are more open to read it and to ask questions, because they don't know exactly, what the Beatles timeline was or what happened each and every month in the timeline of the Beatles. And they're more open to question, to investigate. It's very hard to sell the new information to a person who is an avid Beatles fan, because everything is very clear to them. The timeline, the information, the old information, the official information, Now, I thought about myself, and I had to digest the new information in bits. I mean, I saw your presentation, then I got the memoirs, and it took time. And here in one book, which is my book, I'm giving them everything in almost 250 pages. So it's very difficult to digest all at once. But again, I'm giving them all the references, everything they can check and decide for themselves. If they see Olivia Harrison speaking to Paul McCartney behind the stage and calling him "Hello, Billy," it's open for interpretation. It's either you think that what you're saying is real, or maybe somebody played with a video. Think about it. But fortunately for us, this is not the only piece of information we have. We have many pieces of new information. So it's not that we're depending on just one video. But again, that's my position. I trust the new information because it makes more sense to me. Okay. But again, everyone can read and judge for themselves.
How are you getting the book out? How are you disseminating? How are people becoming aware of it?
I have a Facebook page and a LinkedIn page. I'm selling my book through my website. So this is what you may call an independent way of selling. So it's more difficult because you don't have the attention of the big book companies here in Israel, but it's okay for me. And I think that we know that we have to be very patient with this story, which you and I know that started. I mean, the new phase started in 2006, and I mentioned it also in my book with the Paul is Dead, I Am a Phony channel. And then 2009, the first memoirs, 2018, the second memoirs, then Billy's Back, your presentations in recent years. So it takes time. We're 15 years in the what I call the new information era. So it's going to take more time. I mean, we'll have hopefully new information in the third edition of Memoirs this October. And I'm sure that more things will happen as we go along. So if people don't discover my book now, maybe there'll be an opportunity to discover it sometime later.
Now, when we spoke about 2 weeks ago, we were chatting on Skype. You had mentioned that you had the opportunity to talk about the book on Israeli mainstream outlets.
Radio station, yes.
Radio station. Okay. How did that go?
Well, I had some connections, and the guy who is doing a weekly show about culture in general, he just interviewed me, and it was a very positive interview. But other channels, I mean, television, radio, newspapers, and major websites, they just don't want to deal with it for the time being. They want hard proof. They want either DNA results. They want a press conference. They want to hear the man himself speak. We don't know if this is going to happen. I think this is not going to happen. And also they find it difficult to understand gradual disclosure. It's either we want the information right here, right now,
right,
or don't bother us. But the process here, the gradual disclosure, this is something that is difficult to handle. But that's the way we're getting the information. I mean, every now and then we get some new information, and we have to analyze it, and that's just the way it works. And I'm telling them, listen, we can talk about it now. Even if you oppose my information, let's talk about it. Let's see what resonates with you. But it falls under the fake news, headline. So there's really nothing I can do about it.
It's interesting because there is disclosure. He has disclosed from the sheer fact that he has released memoirs through Tom. The man that is playing the part has written a book, but they don't even want to be bothered with that, right?
No.
Because they go back, how do we know he actually is behind the book and all of that? And even when you try to explain how it is that he is behind the book, because all you need to do is to start to connect some dots, and you can very easily see and conclude that he has to be behind the writing of the memoirs of Billy Shears. You had mentioned, Ofer, that there are red flags or holes in the narrative.
Yes.
Can you give us examples of what you're talking about there?
Yes, in one of the chapters in my book, I focused on the time, the fall of 1966, right after the Beatles came back from their last appearance at Candlestick Park, and all the way up to the Christmas period of 1966. So we're talking about September, October, November, and December. But this is a period where, if you check the Beatles timeline, nothing major happened. No new music, no shows, no group interviews. But this should have been, but we know that a lot has happened, because that's the turning point in the story. And I found at least 4 major things that did happen, and the people who support the official narrative claim that they are just circumstances, and I call them holes in the narrative. Okay, so it's, again, 2 different perspectives. The first thing I found is the Beatles' complete stoppage of performing live. Now, this is something that is very unusual for a major band to continue recording, and we know that they continue to record 5 more albums, starting with Sgt. Pepper in 1967, until they broke up, but they completely stopped performing live. This is something which is very unusual for, I'm not talking only of the Beatles, I'm talking about take any band or any artist, and of course, there were excuses for the stoppage of live performances. The backlash from the John Lennon comment about the Beatles being more popular than Jesus. And I think this is not an excuse for me, because this only happened in the US. I mean, they could have continued to perform in Europe or in other places where nobody cared about what John Lennon said. Then they said that the Beatles the band members were tired because the schedule, the lineup was very hectic. I mean, doing 19 shows in 17 days. But again, they could have taken some time off, 4, 5, 6 months, and go back on the road. I mean, this is something that they've done before. They appeared 1,461 times, according to the website Setlist.fm, between 1960 and 1966. This is, I mean, wow. This is like 2 shows every 3 days on average for 6 years. So you don't go from that to 0. It doesn't make sense. And of course, they were the number 1 band in the world. So all of a sudden, no more live gigs. So this should have raised a red flag among other Beatles fans. But Beatles fans usually they accept the narrative. So if the Beatles said that they were tired or that they suffered from the backlash from what John Lennon said, they accept it. No critical thinking, no questioning why did the greatest band in the world, who appeared almost 1,500 times, stopped performing completely until they broke up, with one exception, which is the rooftop performance in January of 1969. So this is one thing. Then another thing I found was no new music for the holidays. Now we know in general that the Thanksgiving to New Year's is what we call the Christian world, the holiday season. For businesses, it's a very lucrative time of the year. Okay, I mean, a lot of businesses in many different areas sometimes do 50 to 60% of their annual income just in those 6-7 weeks, the last weeks of every calendar year. Now, the Beatles issued new music every year before. 62, there was one single, but in 63, 64, and 65, there was new music, new singles, and a new album. And of course, they did very well during the holiday season. And then we come to 1966, and all of a sudden, no new music. Why is that? Okay, so that's another thing which think about.
Well, another example, Ofer, of the holiday season and getting material out, whether a single or an album, is Rubber Soul.
Yes.
They wanted Rubber Soul in the stores, in retail by December 3rd so that they could capitalize on the holiday season.
So 1966, no new music. And this is a question. Also, we know they did a lot of group interviews. And all of a sudden, in the forthcoming months after, starting from September, there were separate interviews. And I checked that. We don't see them together. Okay? And also, there is the story of the movie The Family Way, which is not a very important movie, but the story here is that the movie was promoted by the soundtrack because the soundtrack was written by Paul McCartney. If you check the album, it says music composed by Paul McCartney. Now, this is, I think, recorded in October of 66 or something like that. And of course, you can find it in memoirs that Billy admits that he was the one who wrote the music. Now, the thing here is, the question here was, how can a person who did not know to read or write music compose a score for an orchestra, an instrumental score, 24 minutes? And you can listen to it online nowadays for the movie The Family Way. Okay? Now, I'm talking before memoirs. If you just check that, and even in the book we're going to talk about soon, many years from now, or other Beatles books, there are quotes about Paul McCartney, and we're talking about biological Paul, not knowing music theory, not knowing how to read and write music. And I'm not talking about pop songs, okay? Maybe you can deal with pop songs. I'm talking about writing music for the guy who's playing the cello, the guy who's playing the violin, writing music, writing a score. So how is it possible? But this is something, when I talk to people here in Israel, the Beatles fans, they don't know, but they don't care. I mean, it's not a big deal for them. It's not an important movie. It's not an important soundtrack. But again, it's an open question, and it should raise the red flag. This is not possible for a guy with no music theory. And we're talking about 1966. No computers, no software. You need to write it on a piece of paper, sheet music.
Right.
Simple. So this is something that this is on page 239 in Memoirs. Again, the book says that Paul could not read or write music, confirms that. There was also an interview, I think, in 2018 where Billy said that, mentioned the fact that he didn't know what I was talking about, of course, biological Paul. He didn't know how to read or write music. So again, this should really at least initiate a discussion among Beatles fans. What's going on here?
Well, this is reinforced also by the other Beatles. So John Lennon, in the Playboy interview going back to 1980, he clearly stated that they could not read or write music. And there's a interview I actually rewatched, and it was George Harrison on the Dick Cavett show. And in that interview, George said that he could not read or write music. So Lennon was talking about the band as a whole. Harrison was talking about himself. And there are multiple interviews out there where Billy says that he, as Paul McCartney, the Paul McCartney character, could not read or write music. But we clearly see evidence to the contrary, where he, as William, he's trained. He's a composer. He can score music. So that's a very, very good point. I wanted to go back to something, though, that you mentioned earlier, Ofer. I want to make sure we cover this. Two things. The other thing with them playing live would be the height difference, right, between Paul and Billy and biological Paul. Right. So that would have been a lot easier to see.
Yes. And you can clearly see the difference on the rooftop concert, which you just mentioned.
Yeah.
They did film it from the side. They separated. I mean, Billy was on one side, John Lennon and George Harrison on another side, but you can clearly see. I think they lowered the microphone for Billy also, so he leans with his head. If you get a chance to see it again, you'll see it, but I see the differences in height clearly.
Yeah, I do too, and it's interesting that you should mention Let It Be because, folks, we did talk a little bit about Let It Be before we got started here, and I had mentioned that we see this lanky type of character, Paul McCartney in Let It Be. You can tell he has long legs, and you're right. During the filming of Let It Be, there are many situations throughout the film where they try to disguise Billy's height to kind of position him so that he looks smaller and he's in line with the rest of the Beatles, in particular with John and George. The other thing, too, Ofer, that you mentioned is the Beatles, their concerts made money and they were very profitable. So can you talk to us a little bit about that? Because this is something that I have mentioned previously where they did make EMI. They actually made the British government a lot of money. But you went through some of the numbers. So take us through that a little bit.
Well, I checked some information on the last tour in the US in August of 1966. And another reason to at least question the reasoning behind the complete stoppage of live performances is that these performances were very lucrative. I found out that the average price ticket on the tour, I think, was $5. I know it sounds ridiculous today, but we're talking about 1966. I think in New York, at Shea, the average price was $5.65. But regardless, let's say $5. So if 50,000 people went to Shea for a 35-minute show, revenue was $250,000. That's a lot.
Right.
We're talking about 1966. I mean, it's a lot of money today, but think going back to 1966. So if you add those 19 shows, I found out that they made the revenue approximately was between $3 to $4 million. Okay, and this is for 30 to 35 minutes show. I'm not belittling the difficulties of running from town to town. I know it's tiring, it's very difficult, but again, that's the life on the road. I mean, back in 1966. For the Beatles and their controllers, this was very, very lucrative. So stopping that completely looks very strange to me. Okay? And again, they could have taken a few months rest, get it together, and go on the road again. I mean, in the 67, 68, 69. But we know that didn't happen. And again, the biggest band in the world. So this is what I found.
Right. Just stopped. Now, the other question I have for you is that some folks might be saying, oh, hold on a second, Ofer. The Beatles did release material for Christmas in 1966, and it was the album A Collection of Oldies. Yes. Yeah. So why doesn't that count?
I'm talking about new music. This was the case, again, in the previous years. And in fact, the following year, 67, you had the Magical Mystery Tour, etc. But again, the problem with the oldies album is, first of all, no new music, which we talked about. And then you're talking about oldies from the previous 3 years. I mean, usually when a band issues an oldies album, it covers a range of more years or more music. So again, I'm not saying that this by itself is questionable, but if you add that to the other things, and again, people who trust the official narrative, it seems circumstantial to them.
Right.
I don't think it's circumstantial. I think it happened because a major thing happened. And that's the death and replacement of Paul McCartney. This supports the theory, okay? And this is in addition to the very different look of the new Paul around this time period. And we can see it in separate places. I mean, there is, if you even check the official pictures from the Family Way, there's some photos. I'll try to send you some. And you see the guy with the fake mustache, the wig, the long face, and sitting in front of a few people, the guy with the cello, the guy with the violin. And he's like explaining to them or conducting them. I don't know what's going on there. That's the official pictures for the Family Way. That's October 66. November 66, you have the pictures from the Kenya visit. Bailey with Mal Evans. You can see it, either stills images, or if you check several of the I Am a Phony videos, you can see him there in Nairobi, Kenya. The same guy we see in the Reporting 66, which is a British television show where we see Billy with his new look telling to the camera, I'm not dead, I'm just a good replica. Okay?
Right.
We see consistency, and also late January, the shooting of the Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever videos. Again, you see the same guy, the fake mustache, the wig, the long face. Again, I see two different people, so. And Sgt. Pepper, of course, later on.
Yeah, and Collection of Oldies is a very interesting album because just the title of the album, as you mentioned before, Ofer, a collection of oldies. Well, these songs aren't old. The oldest song on the album is about 3 years, right?
Yes.
Why wasn't it called a collection of hits?
Yes.
So oldies was a point of delineation. So oldies meant the old band, songs from the old lineup, and then going forward, it's going to be the music of the new lineup, which included Billy. And of course, the album that followed Collection of Oldies is Sgt. Pepper. So the Collection of Oldies album, even though it kind of gets lost in the sauce many times when you talk about Beatle releases, is actually a very important album from a symbolism perspective. It's very symbolic of the change that took place. Would you agree?
Yes. And of course, you need very little time to put out a collection album. I mean,
right.
The music has already been recorded. But again, this was very unusual because the group always recorded and performed live. All of a sudden, no new music, no more live shows. So at least, I mean, people should question what was going on in that time period. So this is something I wrote about, and I try to show that something big happened. The only other, I checked a lot of other major artists in the 60s, and the only other occurrence which is, similar in a way, was the Bob Dylan story. July 29th of 1966, he had his accident. And after that, different, we don't know what happened after that. He stopped performing at least for a year and a half.
Yeah.
He disappeared. There are rumors that the new Bob Dylan is someone else, but I don't want to get into that because, I didn't check that, and it's a long story. But anyway, artists usually record music and perform. It's that's what they do. And I don't have to tell you that. I mean, you're a musician and you know a lot about the music world. Again, these red flags really stand out for me to show that something big happened. That's how I read it.
Yeah, and before we move on, because we're going to talk about your research into Barry Miles's book many years from now, but before we go there, you and I actually talked about this offline going back, several months ago, but when we talk about the set lists and the songs that the Beatles were playing, when we go back to the concert tour that they were doing after Revolver was released, they didn't play any songs from Revolver. Now, I've spoken about this on my channel a number of times, but did you want to talk about that a little bit? Because that's very strange.
We talked about it last time. Again, the same set list, 11 songs, maybe on some of the show there was a 12th song, but the same songs every day. Okay, so no variation. And also 2 of the 11 songs were covers. We're talking about 1966. After the Beatles already issued 7 albums, they had many songs and many hits from which to choose. Why do you play 2 covers out of an 11 songs set list? This is very strange. I mean, we know that they loved covering old rock and roll songs, but come on, you're the Beatles, the biggest band in the world. You have already 7 albums with many, many hits. I mean, people know the songs and people buy the music. So not only no new songs from Revolver right after you issue the album and you go on tour, but also only 11 songs every night on the stage, and 2 out of the songs are covers. This is very strange to me. I know that other major groups, once they establish themselves and they issue new music and they become successful, no need to play covers anymore.
Right.
So we're talking about the Beatles, 1966. This is 3 years after they started, or a little more, maybe 4 years. And we see that they play 2 covers. This is very strange.
Yeah, no, it is very strange. And it's something that indicates that, and you and I have talked about this, the reason for it is because they hadn't learned how to play the songs after they went in to sing the vocals for Revolver, because my premise is based upon Rubber Soul, that they sang on the recorded tracks. They didn't play on them. And because they had not learned how to play the songs on Revolver, they weren't taught the songs, they weren't able to take them on the road afterward. That's my thinking.
The newest song that they played on the concert, the tour, was, I think, Paperback Writer.
Yeah.
Which was the single from the spring of 66. And it was number 1 in the USA around that time. So this is a song they did play. But again, nothing new from Revolver to promote the album, to promote the single. We talked about it, Eleanor Rigby and Yellow Submarine, double A side. Again, this should raise questions among Beatles fans, but this is something I don't see people talking about or questioning. I saw in Wikipedia, it says that they opted not to play songs from Revolver. That's what we get in Wikipedia. They opted. Well, okay.
Yeah.
Can I say?
Well, they would have blew the audience away if they had fired up Taxman.
I'm sure.
Right?
I'm sure.
Or, as you and I have talked about before, why couldn't they have done a scaled-down version of Yellow Submarine?
Yes.
So it's very, very strange. And like I said, Ofer, you and I are on the same page with this. The reason, in all likelihood, is because they didn't know how to play those songs. Now, let's talk about Barry Miles and his book Many Years From Now. So can you tell us a little bit about who Barry Miles is?
Yes, and in fact, this is something which is not in my book because my book is so, condensed with information. And this is something I worked upon, but I didn't put it inside my book because, again, my book is crammed with tons of information. And for somebody who just reads it, I think this would have been too much. But again, we're still in a stage of two narratives, which is, again, very strange. I mean, why would you need a new narrative if we already have the official narrative? So what I did, and I'm sure you have old Beatles books. I mean, the average Beatles fan, I know people here in Israel have books from the UK, from the US. And I picked this book because it was very interesting. I mean, Barry Miles was a colleague of the Beatles. He was a British writer and author. He was a close friend of the Beatles. And he knew both Pauls, because we know that he knew Paul from 65, at least from 1965. He was also one of the co-owners of the Indica Gallery, which was a very famous place in London. That's the place where Yoko met John Lennon. And he helped start the indie newspaper, International Times. And his book, many years from now, was issued in 1997. And his book is basically based on hundreds of hours of 35 exclusive, taped, different interviews he conducted with Billy between 1991 and 1996. So they basically went over all of the Beatles narratives from beginning to end. And it was very interesting to read what Billy had to say. Now, we have to also remember that this book came 2 years after the anthology. I think that at that time, this was a major release, because you get, I mean, a lot of information from, supposedly Paul McCartney. And it talks a lot about the writing of the songs, which we'll get to in a second. Now, the exercise I bought this book in 97 or 98, and I haven't touched it for so many years. But I decided to reread it. And the main thing I found out, or the main exercise I did with myself, is whenever I saw the word Paul, colon, and then a quote, I changed in my head the word Paul to Billy and tried to figure out what he's telling us or what was going on. Okay? Now, this is something, of course, I couldn't have done in the past. But knowing the new information now, I wanted to see how he describes the old narrative, or the official narrative. And I found a lot of very interesting stuff. Now, the main thing I found, and this is something I wanted to hear your take on, he describes a lot of the writing of the songs, the Beatles songs, and he always talks about, this is a 50-50 song. I mean, 50% me, 50% John, or 80% me, 20% John, or vice versa. And I have to keep reminding myself that Billy, at that time, according to the new information, was the ghostwriter, or one of the ghostwriters for the Beatles. So maybe what he's describing, either it's a made-up story, or made-up stories, or this is what actually happened. He went to John's house, or John went to his house. They sat together. I'm talking about Billy and John. Maybe there were sessions with biological Paul, which is very interesting. And the actual division between the who wrote what is mainly because Bill Shepherd and John Lennon. Now, this is a possibility. We have no way to find out. But I'm reading, again, song after song. There are a lot of, he talks about many of the songs on the albums. And between 62 and 66, he was behind the scenes. So maybe while in London, they did meet. They had conversations for song ideas. Maybe they started writing. What's your take on it? Is it possible?
So are you saying, make sure I understand the premise here, that this goes back to pre-1967, so biological Paul is still in the picture, and you're saying that is it possible that Billy was there with both John and Bio Paul, and they were talking through songs?
Maybe. I'm questioning.
it's possible. We weren't there. We don't know. Song ideas, themes for songs,
lines,
that type of thing there. And if Billy was in the picture as a ghostwriter and as a session musician back during the 62 through 66 period, it's very possible that these types of discussions went on. Now, the thing is, Billy wasn't, if he was ghostwriting, and I do think he was, because I think he dropped us a big clue when he talked about that he wrote the music to In My Life.
Yes.
Okay, so when he said that, the mainstream media went into damage control, saying, oh, no, he misremembered. A computer analysis shows us that it was indeed John Lennon that wrote the song and so on. And you and I have talked about this. There is no way that you misremember writing a song like In My Life, which is one of the most famous rock and roll songs of all time. You just don't forget that. So I think that Billy was there. It's possible that they were, that these ghostwriters and these songwriters, and I do not think it was just Billy. I think they had probably, I'm taking a guess here, maybe they had a half dozen songwriters that were on the EMI staff, Tavistock staff, that were there to formulate and put together these songs. And yes, it's quite possible that the Beatles themselves shared ideas, thoughts, had input into themes for songs, what these songs might sound like. It's possible. I would say that if they did have those types of dialogues and conversations, I don't think it was the norm. I would think that maybe it was one-off types of situations where they were able to sit down together and talk about stuff. My take on it is that, generally speaking, the way it worked is George Martin, and in all likelihood working with Theodore Adorno in the background, were responsible for taking in song content that would ultimately wind up on the recorded albums. That's how I think it worked in general. George Martin was directing and managing this process. His role was far, far more than what is depicted in the official narrative. And they just basically depict him as a producer, and he had some ideas, and he was very good with the technology and all that stuff. But in my view, based upon my research, it goes way, way beyond that. But your premise that perhaps they did have conversations and dialogue with Bio Paul and John, anything's possible. I mean, you can't discount it. I mean, they had to run into each other, right? They had to be in the studio. Maybe they ran into each other outside the studio, because it was an operation. It was an initiative. It was a project, and you had all these people that were in the mix. And to think that they did not interact with each other once in a while, I don't think that that's a likely scenario. They did run into each other, and they did have conversations. So I think you're possibly right. That could have happened.
So this was the main thing that I was thinking about. I did find other stuff while rereading many years from now from Barry Miles. I think there are a lot of made-up stories there. I mean, the two songs, She's a Woman and Lovely Rita, where you read the description and Billy says that he wrote them on the street. How can you write a song while walking on the street? Well, maybe, I don't know.
Well, we get a lot of stories like that where they say that they wrote these great songs on the fly. And I don't put a lot of stock in those stories at all. I think that those are stories that are put out there to do exactly what you're saying, is to show how great they were, what geniuses they were. But in reality, the probability that that's how songs were written, especially some of these songs which were really phenomenal songs, that's not how they were written.
Yeah, so this was very strange. And then I found another story where Paul is talking about In My Life, which you just mentioned 2 minutes ago. And he says that he arrived at John's house when he started reminiscing about the old days in Liverpool. And then John had a few words and Paul started a tune. And then there was a quote, I sat there and put together a tune based in my mind on Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. Songs like You've Really Got a Hold on Me and Tears of a Clown had really been a big influence. You refer back to something you've loved. So I recall writing the whole melody. Now, the only problem with that is these songs were written and issued at least 2 years after 1965. So how can you write a song in 1965, which is based on a song issued in 67?
Yeah.
But again, this is maybe an anecdote. I mean, I'm not, but I think that there are many different type of the way Billy describes writing the songs, which if you really read it carefully, you at least have to ask yourself a question or questions. What he's talking about? What really happened? So, and then there's A Day in the Life. And he describes writing the orchestra part for A Day in the Life. And he says, we wrote out the music for the part where the orchestra had proper chords to do. After the line, somebody spoke and I went into a dream. And 2 pages later, he says the two conductors, that's the Barry Miles' writing, the two conductors raised their batons, George Martin in evening dress and Paul McCartney in a red butcher's apron and a purple and black psychedelic paisley shirt, and recording began. So he's describing a situation where George Martin and Paul McCartney conducted the instrumental.
Yes.
But we know that Paul did not know how to read or write music. So now all of a sudden he's a conductor. So this was very, very, very strange. And we know it is clearly Billy with George Martin managing the orchestra. But again, the average reader of the book can gather from this quote that Paul did know how to write and read music, and it's very confusing.
Well, it also tells us that the relationship between Billy and George Martin was very tight.
Yes.
And so as I've done the research, I do not believe the story that Billy really got to know George Martin when Sgt. Pepper came to be, which was Billy's baby. I believe that Billy has been in the timeline for a very long time, probably going back as early as 1962, maybe even before that. Who knows? So when we read stuff like that, where he and George Martin are working very closely, collaborating very well, it says to me that they are used to working together, that they are a team, and that they have worked together before. I mean, that's what it says to me. The other thing I wanted to mention, Ofer, before you go on with In My Life, and Billy saying that, he wrote that with John, and talking about the lyrics. In my presentation, Did the Beatles Write All Their Own Music? I did a whole piece on In My Life, and I showed the original lyrics that John allegedly wrote, and it was nothing even remotely close to the final version of the lyrics. The original lyrics that we're told that Lennon wrote down were choppy. They were written in prose. It didn't flow. And then, of course, when we get to the final lyrics, they're brilliant. They're just great, great lyrics. So I think that maybe John did take a stab at it, and it didn't make the mark. And so they had a professional lyricist come in and pen the lyrics to In My Life. A lot of the lyrics in the Beatles' early songs, I believe, too mature. They reflect too much life experience for guys that were in their early 20s, like the song For No One as an example. That's one of my favorite ones to pick. Anyway, I don't want to digress, but I just wanted to cover that. I just didn't want to pass that opportunity up to talk about the lyrics when you mentioned In My Life.
I just wanted to finish up about the discrepancy between Paul not knowing to read and write music, and then we find out that he did, which is very confusing. On a later page in the same book, many years from now, by Barry Miles, there is the mention of Golden Slumbers, which is from Abbey Road, as we know. Paul wrote Golden Slumbers at his father's house in Liverpool. Okay. McCartney had remarried, giving Paul a stepsister, Ruth, and some of her sheet music was on the piano, including Thomas Decker's lullaby, Golden Slumbers. I liked the words so much, Paul said. I thought it was very restful, a very beautiful lullaby, but I couldn't read the melody, not being able to read music. So I just took the words and wrote my own music. So did you know how to write music or not? I mean, this is very confusing.
Yeah.
So again, reading it in 1997, I mean, I'm sure almost no one paid attention to it. But now this is really, this is really strange. So all of these examples of conducting the instrumental for A Day in the Life and then Golden Slumbers. And so now we know that this is probably Billy and not Paul. Now for the people who go along with the official information, it's Paul McCartney all the way. I mean, he's a genius. I mean, of course, he knew how to read and write music and everything is very clear to them. But even if you read many years from now alone, not reading memoirs, not having any information, any new information, there are very, really discrepancies that stand out. The book contradicts itself. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, in fact, I believe that on page 330 of the book, you mentioned in the outline that there's a long paragraph about Paul composing a perfect solo for the piccolo player David Mason for Penny Lane.
Yes.
So on one hand, he's telling us, well, Golden Slumbers, I couldn't read music, so I banged out the chords and I came up with my own tune. And then in the book on page 330, it's telling us that he composed the perfect solo for Penny Lane.
Again, now that you read it, even if you don't have any new information, I mean, it should stand out as very contradictory.
Yeah.
Very strange. And then at the end, towards the end of the book, Paul did not stop with painting. He composed an oratorio for the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic Society. I mean, we know he issued several, classical music albums. Okay? One of them, by the way, is The Standing Stone, as you know. We see that he is an accomplished musician. I mean, but again, I think this is something that at least should raise an eyebrow for the average reader. I mean, regardless if you're a Beatles fan or not.
Yeah.
You cannot figure out what's going on just reading this book.
Yeah, and the thing is, you have to have the wherewithal that when you read a book like this, to understand going in, to look for discrepancies. I think what a lot of people do is they read the book and then they don't even recognize the discrepancies as they're reading them. They just kind of just read. And one of the things that I've learned with this research into this particular conspiracy is that you just can't read because everything is layered. There's encoding. And quite frankly, there are mistakes made. Billy does misspeak sometimes. And he may not recall what he said a year or two previously. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
And so he creates a conflict, but most people, they don't try to reconcile it. They just go with whatever he said on that particular day.
It will be very interesting to compare the information in the new book, the lyrics, because there will be information about 154 songs that he wrote to either this book many years from now or to memoirs or to, and I'm sure there'll be discrepancies.
Yeah.
But it'll be interesting to compare versions.
Well, also, the new memoirs box set is coming out in October. Let me just read something here. I had said to Tom, if there's any updates to the book, just let me know because people are asking me about when is it going to ship? Is it on time? How can I order it? And I'm talking about the new box set coming out in October. And Tom wrote me, and he said that, let me just read this here. It says that the new version, the box set, has 180 footnotes that will make some obscure parts of the book much more emphatic, sometimes disturbingly so. Very interesting.
Yes.
And he also said that there's a big reveal in the box set. I don't know what that is. So I am going to do a video later on today to let my audience know what's going on. And but you're the first to hear about this. So the point I'm making is, going back to your point, is that we have these different sources. And for those of us that are doing this research, we have to check multiple sources to see where there are these discrepancies and where these red flags, as you call them, or these holes are, right? So when he comes out with the lyrics and then he comes out with the new box set of memoirs, we're going to have even more information that we have to work our way through to figure out where there are gaps, where there are holes.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting. And it's very soon, October, November. I also wanted to mention another thing that I found an interesting comment in this book many years from now. And this is something we'll talk about a little bit later. Mick Jagger often called at Cavendish Avenue, and it was Paul and Mick who often checked with each other to make sure that the Beatles and the Stones did not release a new single within the same few weeks, which would have split sales and jeopardized both their chances of reaching number one. Now, when I read this comment, first of all, I think that it was really coordinated behind the scenes. I mean, I don't think Mick Jagger called Paul or Billy every time a new single or a new album came out.
Right.
I mean, this is something that was coordinated. And we'll talk about a little bit later about the my findings, because I did check the release dates of albums and singles of the Beatles and the Stones in the UK and in the US. And I found that there was a lot of coordination there, but we'll talk about it. So again, just to summarize, this book many years from now, again, it goes along with the official narrative. And again, even if you read it by itself and you're not familiar with the new information, there are a lot of discrepancies there.
I was going to ask you this at the end of our talk here, but I might as well ask you now. The book is only in Hebrew now, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so there's no English version of it or any other language. Are there any plans at some point to have it in English?
Yes, I'm hoping, but it'll take time. I'm definitely thinking about it.
Okay, and for folks that can read Hebrew, how were they able to order the book? How were you getting it fulfilled?
Well, the print edition is on my website, and then there's a digital edition, which is sold on one of the major platforms here in Israel.
Okay.
Which is called Ivrit, which is in English is Hebrew, means Hebrew. And it's basically, well, I'd say it's the biggest digital platform for books in Israel.
Okay.
So they can get it there.
All right, so I'll put all the links down below in the description box for those that are interested.
Okay.
And I really do hope, I'm not putting any pressure on you. I'm hoping that you do get the book out in English, because personally, I would love to read it.
Thanks.
Did you want to move on to social engineering?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, so what about social engineering? I know you and I know a lot about this. Let's talk to the audience.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about something specific, which, again, this is something that we have to think about as a community, which really, you lead on the subject, but we talk about it a lot. But I noticed that there was a very short period of time between the time period where almost no one knew who the Beatles were until they were the biggest band in the world. This should have taken a lot longer, in my opinion. But this is what I found. October of 1962 was the month where the first official single, Love Me Do, was released in the UK. Okay? At that time, the Beatles were known in two places only. That's Liverpool in the UK and Hamburg in Germany. These are the two places where they played as an unknown group. Okay? So October of 1962, they did get the first, national exposure in terms of releasing an official single in the UK. The song started playing on the radio there. Now, we jump to April of 1964, just 18 months later, a year and a half. And I mark this as the month which officially put them as the biggest band in the world, because on April 4th, they had the entire top 5 on the Billboard chart. Can't Buy Me Love was number 1, and then number 2, 3, 4, and 5 were all Beatles singles. But this is something that never happened before. Not even with Elvis. It was like the major artist before the Beatles era. Okay? So October 62, no one knows who the Beatles are worldwide. And in April of 64, which is 18 months later, they're the kings of the world. Now, when I talk to people here about this, they say, what do you want? They had great marketing. Well, I agree that the marketing was great. But I think this is a stage, or this is a phase beyond great marketing. And I'll try to prove my point by saying that in the US, until the first quarter of 64, nobody knew who the Beatles were. The very first singles of the Beatles were issued in January of 64. And in fact, what I found is that the people behind the scenes, behind the Beatles project, as you called it, they flooded the American record stores with Beatles products. So in January alone, there were 7 singles and 2 albums by the Beatles issued at once. Now, this is very unusual because usually if you want to break a new artist, you concentrate on his new album or a new single or a new single and a new album. But here, what they did in America was that they put a lot of music together. So again, if you walked into a store anywhere in America in the first quarter of 1964, the stores there were 2 albums and 7 different singles. This is very unusual, okay? And then you had the 3 Ed Sullivan shows. The Beatles appeared on Ed Sullivan on 3 consecutive Sundays. This is what I found. By the way, the first appearance was on February 9th. Think about the date.
Right.
9+2. And then the following Sunday, and then the 3rd Sunday, they had a taped show. So they got a lot of exposure, okay, appearing on Ed Sullivan in prime time. I think this was CBS, if I'm not mistaken. But again, the general idea, what I was thinking about, I mean, the marketing push was beyond a regular marketing push. I mean, this is social engineering. This is telling America, these are the Beatles. You have to buy the product now. It's in the stores. There are 7 singles and there are 2 albums. And again, on the April 4th chart, the top 5 songs were Beatles songs, and 12 out of the 100 were Beatles songs altogether, which is amazing. I mean, this is something that, it's very hard to comprehend.
It's a massive push.
Yes. Way beyond great marketing to me.
Yes.
Okay?
I agree.
And a very short period of time, the first quarter of 64, that's when Beatlemania started in the US. So this is something, again, to think about in terms of social engineering. This is what they did with the product, with the music.
No, I'm glad you're talking about this, Ofer, because this is something that I focus on as well. We have these very short time frames in which big things happen. On my own little timeline, I just jotted something down here that I've been meaning to talk about, and I haven't had a chance yet, so I'll mention it here. The official story tells us that the Beatles arrived in Hamburg mid-1960. I think it was August of 1960 with their first manager/handler, Alan Williams. Then in June of 1962, on biological Paul's birthday, this is what we're told by the official narrative, they signed the contract with EMI. So from August of 1960 to June of 1962, when they signed the contract with EMI, only 2 years had elapsed. That's it. So they show up in Hamburg in August of 1960 as this very rough around the edges band. And then in June of 1962, less than 2 years later, they inked a contract with EMI and George Martin. And then from June 1962 to March 1963, in March of 1963, on March 22nd, that's when they released their first album, Please Please Me, in the UK.
Yes.
So only 9 months had elapsed from the time that they signed the contract to when Please Please Me was released worldwide. And then 11 months after Please Please Me was released, that's when they show up in the US in February of 1964. So we're looking at this timeline, which is around 3.5 years from August 1960 to when they arrive in the US in February of 1964, and we have all of this activity. This is exponential growth, Ofer. This is not gradual. Now, some people, of course, are going to say, well, that's because they were so talented. But what I always ask people to do is to go back to my presentation, did the Beatles write all their own music? And you're going to get a lot of background as to what was really going on with regard to their skill level, what they were capable of, especially when we're talking about time constraints. There was a lot of time compression in the Beatles' schedule to do anything other than to run around and do gigs, especially when they were in Hamburg. I have an interview, and I know you've probably heard it, Ofer, from Pete Best, where he said that by the time they finished up 7 hours of playing in Hamburg at the clubs, and then they went back to the dive that they were living in, and they woke up about 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and they had to be back at the club by 6 o'clock. So they had about a 2 or 3 hour period of time where they got up, they had to eat, they had to get dressed, do whatever. That is what Hamburg was about, until much later on when they played the Star Club, where they were a lot more polished up, buffed up. And this is because of all the handling that was taking place. That's how this was able to progress. There was a lot of people behind the scenes who were orchestrating this and moving this along. So again, folks, August 1960, they're in Hamburg. Then they sign a contract with EMI in June of 1962, which is less than 2 years after they arrived in Hamburg, which was August of 1960. And then 9 months after they signed the contract with EMI, they release Please Please Me in March of 1963, March 22nd to be specific. And then February 1964, they land in America, and it's referred to as the Beatles conquering America. Conquering America, because they knew they needed the American audience in order for this social engineering project to get legs and to take off and to be effective. They knew it, and that's why they called it Conquering America. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that, Ofer, because I've been meaning to talk about this, and I haven't had the chance yet, so the timing is perfect. You just brought this up about this time period, and so there you go.
And one final note, we have to remind ourselves that there was no internet, no social media.
Right.
Nothing went viral. I mean, someone behind the scenes made sure that all of this will happen in no time. I mean, every time period that you just mentioned and the time period that I mentioned, it's very fast, very fast.
Right. All of these records had to wind up in all of the retail outlets. And I'm just going to focus on the U.S. All of them. Not just some of them, all of them. All of the radio stations had to be clued in. Hey, you're playing these records. And like I said, it was a massive machine behind them. That's the only way this could happen. The only way.
Let's talk about the release dates.
Yes.
Okay, so we mentioned a little earlier in our discussion the fact that this comment in the Barry Mars book many years from now about the separation of releases between the Beatles and the Stones. Now, let me just explain for a second what I researched. We always, in memoirs, I think it's page 351, but this is also in many of the old books. We know that the Beatles and the Stones were two sides of the same coin. Okay? They're always mentioned together. Well, the Beatles were more successful than the Stones, but the Stones were very successful. Let's not forget that. Now, the thing is, they recorded for two separate record companies. Okay? The Beatles recorded for Parlophone, which is a label under EMI. The Stones recorded for Decca, which to the best of my knowledge Decca was not part of EMI. Okay? So supposedly, in a competitive market, you compete. I mean, artists issue singles and albums, and there's a competition, and the results, you can see the results every week on the charts, the album charts, the singles chart. Now, although the Beatles and the Stones recorded for two separate companies, I did find that there was a coordination in terms of the release dates of the singles and albums. Okay? Which is very interesting because, first of all, this is research that I did outside of memoirs and outside basically of any other Beatles books. And second, what I found is that there was at least a 4 to 6 weeks period between releases of singles and albums. And I checked 4 categories: UK singles, UK albums, US singles, and US albums. Now, between 1964 and 1970, we had a little more than 6 years where the Beatles and Stones were out there. Okay, well, the Beatles started before the Stones a little bit. Okay,
right.
And we know the Stones continued after 1970. But I'm just talking about the period of time where both of the groups were active together during the same time period. And what I found, again, was a very clear division in terms of release dates. And in fact, many of the singles and albums went to number 1. But the Beatles did not interfere with the Stones, and the Stones did not interfere with the Beatles. So they received basically a playing field for which to sell. I'm not saying that there was, of course, other competition from other artists. That's obvious. But just in terms of the Beatles and the Stones, I think almost 90 to 95% of the releases were separated at least by a 4 to 6 weeks time period. Now, if you see it on a consistent basis, it means that someone coordinated it. It didn't happen by chance. I mean, if it was like for 1 year, for 2 years, maybe a coincidence. But I think that the whole thing was orchestrated from behind the scenes and with very minor discrepancies or minor, maybe very few times where albums were released together. In fact, I found that in the US, I think only in 66 or 68, before the holiday seasons, there were new albums by the Beatles and Stones. But this is the exception. Okay? I'm talking about many singles releases in the US and many album releases. And we know both bands were very active between 64 and 70. And they were very popular. Okay? So this is, it seems to me that there was a hidden hand or some sort of control behind the scenes in terms of the releases. And in fact, many of the albums and the singles went to number 1, number 2, number 3. And this was done in order for each band not to interfere with the release of new music from the other band.
Right.
This is what I found.
So they didn't compete head on. They ensured that there was no conflict. So they separated the release dates so that each band could optimize.
Yes.
Right? So, yeah, I mean, that's a coordinated process, especially like you said, Ofer, when we're talking about over a 6-year period of time. We're not talking about a year or two, but over the entire timeline, when they coexisted together, you're saying that this is the pattern that you found.
Yes.
They didn't compete head on.
No. And I found it to be very interesting. And again, this is just basically upon checking the chart books from the UK and the US. I just thought it's interesting.
No, it was a great piece of work because you sent me over a separate document, and the amount of work you did was unbelievable. It's very well documented, folks. It's something that I hadn't thought to look at, and then when you presented it, I was like, wow, he's absolutely correct. So excellent work on that one.
Thanks.
Did you want to talk about the 1960 through 1962 period?
Yeah, you mentioned it in one of your, I think, presentations recently, and this is something we talked about before recording this show, and I just wanted to get your opinion. We know the Beatles did a lot of shows in Hamburg and Liverpool, but they did not record any music because they were not signed yet. Okay, we're talking about 1960 through 1962, almost the end of 62. And we were just wondering together, what happened with all of the new songs that appeared on the albums, starting with Please Please Me? If these songs were written by them, why didn't they test them on the audiences in Hamburg and Liverpool? Which basically, I mean, many bands do. I mean, many bands, if they issue a new song, maybe even before recording it or issuing it as a single, they play it live just to get the feel from the audience, just to, based on the information we have and we know, and I'm not saying we did a thorough check on this, but this is just something to think about. Where are these songs, the new songs? And maybe you want to elaborate on this.
Well, it's a good point, and I did mention in a commentary video on my Paul is Dead channel that I wanted to look more into the 1960 through 1962 period. I have a lot of notes on it. I have a lot of material on my hard drive where I have to start putting it together. Quite honestly, I just haven't had the time to sit down and do a formal workup of the assessment. But in the Beatles Complete documentary, which goes back to the 1980s, it tells us that Paul McCartney and John Lennon wrote 100 songs between 1956 and 1962, up to the point where they met George Martin. So it is a very good question. So if we're being told they wrote 100 songs in that 6-year period of time, where are they? We don't hear those songs in Hamburg. We don't hear or see those songs on the set lists from 1960 through 1962. What we start to see as they are brought along more so and they're getting ready for prime time, we start to see some, quote, original songs appear here and there. Now, one of the more notable examples would be when they did the Decca demos. I think there were 3 or 4 songs that were original compositions that were recorded for the Decca demo. Now, that's 3 or 4 songs out of what? 100 songs that we're told that they wrote between 56 and 1962. The Decca demo was I forgot the exact date, but it was in 1962. So we really don't see any new compositions until they're getting closer and closer to where the switch is thrown and they're getting ready for worldwide prominence. So the point I'm making is that up until that point, once we follow the timeline, as I mentioned before, 1960 Hamburg, June 1962 they signed the contract with EMI, March of 1963 Please Please Me, February of 1964 they're in the U.S. So we start to see some new material or original compositions kind of emerge in that 1962 time frame. Now, some people will point back and say, oh, there are versions of One After 909 and I'll Follow the Sun that go back to 1960. problem with that is that we have no way of verifying when those versions of those songs were actually written. And because we're just being told that a particular song was recorded in 1960, based upon what we know about this story and how they have fabricated so much of it, you have two choices. You can take it at face value and believe the official narrative that tells you that 1960, or you could say, now hold on a second. We really don't know. And in order to know, you have to investigate and you have to research. And even with a massive amount of investigation and research, it's still not going to be possible in many cases because you don't have access to the actual records, the files, the logs, whatever it is that's out there. But the key point is, because some people want to debate one song, two songs, oh, this song appeared in early 1962 and so on. Okay, that's great. Okay, my explanation for that is the pump was being primed. So they were being fed songs to perform and calling them original compositions. But let's go back to the official narrative and what it tells us. 100 songs were written between 1956 and 1962. Where are they? And the other point I want to make, just a side note, One After 909, that title of that song is also the same year that Aleister Crowley published the Book of the Law in 1909. So we have that connection again. Everything around the Beatles has connection points that are tied into the occult. It just is. A lot of people, they hate hearing this. They don't want to hear this. But, once we march down the research path and you do it in an objective way, it's there. It's just there, So anyway, the point I'm trying to make, Ofer, your observation is the same observation that I made. Where are all of these original songs? And then when we go to the 1962 Mercy Beat article, which was August, September of 1962, what does that article tell us in black and white? That they were going to London to record songs that were written for them and were given to them by their record producer, George Martin. So again, if you wrote all of these songs and they were just great songs, maybe not all 100 were great songs, but let's just say you had 10, 15 that you thought were worthy, why are you recording songs that were written for you? In any case, these are all questions that have to be asked. And at some point, I will sit down and get the 1960 through 1962 period formalized. I don't know how long a presentation is going to be, because these things take a long time, as you know, Ofer. The research that goes in behind this stuff is not something you just whip up in a week or so. It takes a very, very long time to dig into these things because you have to cover so many bases. Because you don't want to look foolish. You don't want to put something out there and somebody's like, oh, you missed that. That was very obvious, And sometimes we do miss things. Clearly we do, But anyway, I hope I answered your question.
I have a follow-up question. This is also something that we talked about on that subject. The first 7 albums, all the way up to Revolver, and we know that during this time period, they performed a lot around the world.
Yes.
Was there ever a situation that songs which are coming on a new album were performed during live shows before the album came out? So was there ever a situation that they tested songs in front of a live audience? And I think the answer is 0. But maybe there are exceptions. We have to check that. But from what we know, from what we've seen, this was not the situation. So this also raises the question of, did they write their own material, or did they write and compose their own material? And I think we know the answer. But this is something to think about. Because many other bands, when they write new music, even before they record it on an official single or album, they test it live. I mean, not all the time, not always, but I think with the Beatles, this never happened.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Now, I don't know. I'd have to go take a look, but I would, based upon the work that I did where I did break down the albums and I started looking at some of the concert tours, I don't think they ever previewed a song prior to the song being released on an album on a later date. I don't think that happened. Now, some artists don't do that, in all fairness,
Okay.
but there are artists that do that in order to start to break the song in. But it is another indicator that something is up. Why wouldn't that happen? Because like you said, Ofer, they were playing an enormous number of shows. And what would it have taken to say, hey, this is a song that's coming up, that's going to be released on an upcoming album. I hope you guys enjoy it, and then play it. So I don't know. It's just another one of those things that we need to look at and examine. And like I've always said with this conspiracy, like with any conspiracy, it's not just one thing that defines the conspiracy. You have to look at a multitude of dots that you need to connect. The example I use, Ofer, is let's just say you have a table full of marbles. The entire table is just marbles. Let's just say there's 1,000 marbles on the table. Most people have their face so close to the table that when you ask them how many marbles are there, they'll say, 3. And then when you ask them to please pick their head up and get the bigger picture, then they see a table that has 1,000 marbles on it. And that's the thing. Whenever you do research, you've got to pick your head up and you've got to see the 1,000 marbles. Those are the 1,000 connection points. Those are the dots that you want to try to connect. If you're only seeing 3 and you connect the 3, then you're going to have a partial story. You're going to have something that is a subset of a much, much bigger picture. And that's probably the best way I can explain it.
That's a good point. And a good observation. Because every time you go and check something, new stuff pops out. And you go and try to figure out what's going on. Really do a lot of critical thinking. Because there's a lot of strange things that happened. And we covered a few today. But you really have to do a lot of critical thinking and at least ask questions. Even if we don't have, clear answers. And again, we're talking about the biggest band in the world. The genius that is the Beatles. It's not some unknown group or this is a group that defined a generation. And as you've mentioned, even today, when you talk about the 60s, I know many great songs from the 60s, which are not just the Beatles, But whenever you talk about the 60s with people, the Beatles always come up.
The Beatles were the 1960s.
Yes.
From a pop music perspective, they were. They defined the 1960s. They were at the head of the parade. The rest of the British invasion, and some great, great bands and great music, but really they were following the Beatles' lead. And Jimi Hendrix, and Hendrix was a whole different take on guitar playing, but Hendrix came once the psychedelic era was kicked off. So Jimmy was attached to the psychedelic era. And what really kicked off the psychedelic era? Well, many people will argue that it was Sgt. Pepper. And we had the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967, which was the Summer of Love. So, that's how it worked. It is all orchestrated. It is all engineered. It's all there to engineer society, to transform society. And the Beatles are a main cog, a very main cog in that wheel.
And again, people find it hard to believe that a lot of major points from the old official narrative are not what we were told. It's very difficult to digest, and I understand that. And people worship the Beatles, in Israel too. But if you try to separate your worship from just the basic facts or the basic ideas of what happened, then you get a completely different picture.
I used to worship the Beatles, Ofer, and it was a very hard pill for me to swallow. I think a lot of people think that, I'm just here to destroy the Beatles' legacy and to destroy the Beatles' story. And I'm not doing that at all. I was a huge, huge Beatle freak. I worshiped the Beatles. It's the whole reason why I got into music. I played guitar, I wrote songs and all of that. So it was very difficult to get into this and start to come to certain realizations. But it is what it is. Once you come at it from an objective perspective, you can start to see it for what it's worth. And you can also see that the Beatles and that whole psychological operation is part of a much, much larger initiative that's been going on for decades and decades and decades to socially engineer and transform our societies and our culture. And that's the thing. And once you understand the bigger picture and then you see that the Beatles are tucked in under that umbrella, then I think it becomes a little easier to understand what went on with the Beatles, what went on with the Rolling Stones, what went on with Led Zeppelin. And we can go on and on and on. But in any case, I'm digressing here a little bit. Now, I think you had a question, Ofer, about the Beatles' Our World television program that was broadcast on June 25th, 1967, and they were playing All You Need Is Love, and there is a scene in the footage where George Martin pushes a button on the console, and your question to me was, Mike, is he pressing the playback button or is he playing the record button? So I think that's your question, right? So tell me some more.
First of all, the video was taken off the internet just recently. I don't know why. I have a video of, collection of the Beatles number ones, the videos for the number one singles. So I watched it there, but it was online and a few months ago it was taken off the air. I don't know why. At the beginning of the video, we see George Martin sitting in the control room and he presses a button and the music starts. I was wondering whether he's pushing the record button or the playback button. I think he's pushing the playback button. That's my take.
I think Billy tells us, and if I'm not mistaken, in memoirs that it was a playback, that they were singing to a recorded track.
Well, all of the videos where you see them play the singles are all playback. That's for sure.
Yes.
Because you hear the singles version, so you know that this is playback.
Yeah, so that live, quote, live version of All You Need Is Love was not live. The only thing live was the vocals.
Yeah, John's vocals, I think, but yeah.
And we see this, like you said, in the videos. One of the recent examples that I pointed out to my audience is if you take a look at the video of Revolution, what you're hearing in the background is the actual recorded track, the instrumentation, and then the Beatles were singing live for the video. And that was the model, by the way. The model was either they lip-synced. I'm talking about bands in general. When you watched a lot of these variety shows back in the 1960s, the 1970s, they did a lot of shows where they were lip-syncing. And the reason why is because they want to make sure that there's no mistakes. You want to be able to get through the song, present the band in the best light. It's basically it. It's marketing. It's promoting a product. It's a brand. That's how it's done. And the Beatles were no exception to that rule. So, and I know I've caused a lot of consternation with some people when I started pointing out certain anomalies with their live performances. Were they playing to backing tracks? Were there offstage or backstage musicians that were playing these riffs in order to make sure that they got pulled off properly, that it sounded right and so on,
George Harrison missing the chord was very obvious on I Feel Fine.
Oh, missing the playing, for Day Tripper.
Day Tripper, excuse me.
Yeah, that was in Budokan. That's very, very obvious. And I've actually had people write me that, people that are in the know, people who are in the industry, people who do this type of work. In other words, they were the backstage or offstage musician, or they were the person that created backing tracks for these bands. And this still goes on today, by the way. This is not something that just happened back in the 1960s. In fact, it's very prevalent today, but the technology has advanced to the point where it appears seamless.
Yeah.
I have one person, a really good person. He's a sound engineer, and he's been in the business for a very, very long time. And I can't say who this person is, and I can't even point to a particular album that he showed me that he worked on. And it was a live album of a band. I'm not going to give out any details because I cannot give up who this person is. I don't want him to wind up in any kind of hot water. But he showed me how this was done, how this album was put together. It's unbelievable how they layer it and create it, how they redo parts that didn't come out right when they were recording, maybe during the concert, how crowd noises are enhanced. It's just unbelievable. And I listened to this one link he sent over to me, and my jaw just dropped. And what he was telling me is, Mike, this is what is done, and this is what people are listening to, but it's not real in a sense, because so much post-production work had gone into it that this is not what you heard if you went to the concert. If you actually sat there and listened to the concert, and then you bought the CD afterward, you're not hearing the same thing. Because when they go put an album out, or they're going to release a documentary or concert footage for public consumption, that thing is going to be buffed up. It's going to be polished up to make sure the best possible versions of those songs, the best possible production and listening experience is going to come forth. People forget it's called the music business. It's a business. They're not there to not make money. They're there to make lots of money. And they're going to make sure that all of the spit and polish and flash is going to be there in order to make their product appealing so that people buy it. Yeah, so the whole thing with All You Need Is Love is another example of where they were playing to a backing track. Singing to a backing track, I should say.
Okay, so that's basically the topics that I wanted to cover. The good thing, I think, is we're still learning a lot about the industry, about the world, and maybe most importantly about ourselves, because we live here, and the reality shows us all kinds of things that we have to try and figure out what's going on, and that's the lesson, I think.
Well, let me ask you this question, Ofer. I get this question asked all the time, so I'll ask another researcher the questions that I get asked, and I'm sure you've been asked it many times. Why is this important? Why are you spending time looking at this? Big deal. So they swapped out a guy.
That's funny because your words are in my book. What you just said now. I said some guys think it's not important as long as the music is great. So they switched the guy. But I think that, again, it reflects on the music business, on show business in general, and on the world. I mean, because if they could pull such an operation, and people still can't believe that the whole thing is very different from what we've been told. I mean, this is one of the main points. And I think that the lesson here is that, first of all, don't worship anyone, a politician, a musician, a movie star, a sports star.
Right.
And you really have to critically think about a lot of things. I mean, the Beatles, this is like the last sacred cow, or I don't know what to call it. And if this is something which is very different from what we've been told, then it's a lesson for us about other things that are going on around the world.
Right.
And at least we have to ask questions. I mean, we don't always have the exact answer or the clear answer. Because a lot of times the people behind the scenes are trying to really fool us. I mean, there's some truth, but there are many lies, and they cover things up. And I mean, people still cannot believe that the Beatles did it. I mean, the old information is so stuck in their heads that they don't want to see that maybe the stuff is not exactly as what we've been told for so many years. So I think there's a lesson here. It's a sad lesson maybe, but it's a good lesson also because we keep learning about the world.
Yeah, it tells you, look, if they can do it here, where else are they doing it? And what you believe is true may not be true, that you are pulled into embracing illusion, and ultimately that illusion is going to steer you into certain directions. It's going to shape your belief system. It may shape your morals, your ethics. It may alter how you might make decisions on things. And I'm not just talking about the Beatles. I'm talking about how this whole world is a construct of illusion. And that's why, to me, the Beatles conspiracy is very important, because once you can get your head wrapped around this, you're like, okay, well, if they can do it here, they can do this anywhere, on any topic, you know. So anyway, I really appreciate you coming on the show, Ofer, and you know that you can come on anytime, because I really do enjoy speaking with you. Your research is top-notch, and you've dug into areas that, you know, I haven't looked into and other researchers haven't. So, you know, we have a loose group of researchers that we're networked into. I view you as one of those folks, and between all of us, there's probably about, you know, 6 of us or so, we help each other to fill gaps that, you know, I haven't touched and others haven't touched, you know. So we're able to fill in more of the picture. We have more parts to the puzzle that we can put together, and we can see the bigger picture that way. So I really, really do appreciate all of your work, and you did a great job. And congratulations on your book.
Thank you very much. And it's always a pleasure to be on your show. And again, it'll be very interesting to see how it ends. And when we get some ending line or ending point where we know what we got right, what we got wrong.
Some vindication.
And you mentioned, just one final note, you mentioned in one, I don't recall, one of your presentations that the end result, or when we'll know what happened, hopefully, whenever this happens, may be even a lot worse than what we know today. It's possible. I mean, maybe there are other areas or there are other major things that we're not even considering right now, because it's a process. It'll be very interesting. I'm just hoping we get some sort of a final, I don't know, an answer, and look back and see what we got right. And
well, I read a part of Tom's note earlier, Ofer, so going to your point about, is there stuff that we don't know about? Does it go deeper? Does it go darker? I don't know. I mean, I have found with this conspiracy, anything is possible. It seems like an endless rabbit hole. And so if I go back to what Tom wrote me, he said that the new book has 180 footnotes that will make some obscure parts of the book, he's talking about memoirs, more emphatic, sometimes disturbingly so. Now, I don't know what that means. That sounds to me like there's going to be some information in the book that's going to rock some boats.
So we'll just wait and see, and it's coming.
Exactly.
Again, thanks for having me on your show. We'll probably meet in the future and see, reflect back on these shows and this show and other shows.
Yeah.
And we'll learn more. And that's always important to me, just to learn.
Well, maybe that February 2023 date that Billy has hinted at, I think it's on page 13 of Memoirs.
Yeah.
Maybe that is a moment in time where a lot more information will come out. I don't know. But it seems like, I'm not even going to say it seems like, he is in a flurry of activity right now, putting information out, right? We've got the new Memoirs box set coming out. We have the lyrics coming out. He did Hulu 321. He's got the Get Back documentary by Peter Jackson. Aside from all of the talk shows and everything else he's doing on social media. So these are major, major deliverables. And this is what I was told earlier on was going to happen as the runway got shorter and shorter on him, that there was going to be this flurry of activity. But I was also told, and it was Tom, and it's also in the book, that we won't have full disclosure until after he passes away. Now, how soon after he passes away, I have no idea. It could be years. I hope it's sooner or later because I would really like to stop doing this. Anyway, well, Ofer, I know it's in the evening there for you in Israel. Again, thank you so much for coming on the show. If you could send me the links to your website, okay, and I'll include that in the description box so people can go to your website, pick up the book, and I'll try to have the show out as soon as I possibly can.
Thanks a lot, and I'll see you soon.
And that concludes another Sage or Quay interview, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Links to my guests' websites and social media are listed in the description box below. And as always, I would like to thank everyone for listening and visiting the blog. You can find all my social media and web links by visiting my hub website at sageofquay.com. Also, if you get a moment, please visit laboroflovemusic.com to check out my music and album releases. And remember, live in truth and always serve creation. It's really that simple. See everyone with the next show. Be safe, enjoy, and God bless.